record. Okay, there we go. We're recording. So good to see everybody. Happy Tuesday, January 19th. I said that in staff meeting earlier and thought, I cannot believe we are more than halfway through the month of January. It's amazing how quickly this is going. And week 14 of The Path. I also can't imagine how quickly that's been going. So we have a lot to cover tonight. I do want to start with just a few announcements. One is just one more invitation. I know it was in the email from Naomi as well. But we had a very lively forum on Sunday with Chris Watson, sharing with us about her work in the work to end systemic racism and anti-Black bias. And if you missed that, it's recorded. But more importantly, I would invite you to consider joining an ongoing conversation with fellow parishioners about that work. And to join me and Naomi in that. So if you're interested, please do reach out. We're kind of at the deciding point. We need to know, right, Naomi?
Ryan, can you just mention, if you can, or Naomi, the dates? I know Saturday, I think it's the 13th is one date, but is it Thursday? And what were the times?
I can. It looked like Naomi was
frozen.
Maybe she's
I'm having some issues.
Okay.
You can see me, but I mean, you can hear me, but you can't see me.
I can see it.
So the plan, as I understand it, is that our intro session will be on Thursday, February 11th from 5 until 9 or so. And then on Saturday, February 13th from 10 a.m. until 2.
Thank you. That's what I needed. Yeah.
And then once we have our group, we'll determine our ongoing meeting time. But that's the two introductory sessions.
Thank you very
I'm
much.
sorry, can you repeat those one more time?
Sure.
February 11th.
Thursday, February 11th from 5 until 9 p.m. and Saturday, February 13th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And that will be kind of our jump starting that conversation together. The other announcement is just a reminder that Michael Patella from St. John's Bible will be with us on Sunday, which is very exciting. So I hope you'll join us at 11:15 for that forum to hear from him. And less exciting, but no less important, same time the following week on the 31st, we have our annual meeting. And I know you all have that in your calendars and you're so excited. It's gonna be the highlight of the month. But I hope you'll join us for that important celebration as we thank those who are rotating off the vestry and elect new vestry people and hear from our parish leadership. So here endeth the announcements, unless anyone has anything else they need to share. Okay, so last week we talked about prophets, and I wonder if it might be helpful before jumping in this week, just to kind of recap some of what we said so that it's fresh in our brains. We talked a lot about prophets as the ears and the eyes who are listening for and looking for God's vision, and then who are brave enough to be the mouthpiece of the Lord to articulate that vision, often by standing outside the power structures of the world. We talked a lot about how there are very few court prophets remembered in the scriptures aside from Nathan. Most of the prophets remembered were those who stood outside the power structures and offered a word of critique, offered a word of truth, speaking the truth, calling those societies and those leaders to more, and warning of the consequences of not following God's will, warning of the consequences of sin. That's my brief definition of a prophet. Does anyone want to add anything that you took away from last week that you want to bring into this space tonight?
Well, my mom found something interesting in her book about the Bible. Solomon was the author of the book of Proverbs.
Absolutely. Yeah, back when we were talking about wisdom, that's absolutely right. Solomon is very wise. Any other thoughts on prophets before we jump into this week?
Many of them got killed because of speaking out.
Right. It's not a safe job being a prophet. And of course, as a country, we remembered the great American prophet, Martin Luther King, who, of course, was in our own day cut down for that very thing. One of the great things, if we're ever allowed to travel again, and you're back in London, is to look at the front of Westminster Abbey, where they have the statues of the great 20th century martyrs, including Martin Luther King, there on the front of Westminster Abbey, but also people like Oscar Romero and the martyrs of Sudan and others in our tradition. So the reality is that the word of the Lord continues to be spoken by brave people in our own day, and it's not always safe. So where we left last week was that the prophet's warning that there are, in fact, consequences for not following God's will, in fact, came true. We saw how the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians in 722. We saw how the southern kingdom of Judah fell to the Babylonians in 597, both BC, of course. And if you think about it, kind of in that long arc of history, of biblical history that we've been talking about these 14 weeks, that's a profoundly momentous thing, right? All the way back in Genesis, God promised Abraham that he would be blessed and that he would have a homeland, right? And throughout the story of the book of Genesis, we see that coming to be. We see that disrupted, of course, with slavery in Egypt, but then it's restored, right? Restored by Joshua, restored all the way through the period of the Judges, the great monarchies of David and Solomon, and even during the troubles of all the kings that followed, they were still in that land that God had promised them. And now they're not. And now they are not in a place where they can worship in that temple that God had promised them as well. And so, it just struck me in a new way, the range of emotions that those people of Israel in exile must have been feeling, right? I could name a whole host of them, but I wonder what you might be feeling if you found yourself in that situation in exile. What are the range of emotions you might be feeling?
Well, you could feel that God had lied. You promised a homeland and then it was destroyed.
So there might be some feeling of doubt, right? Is God really who God said he was?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Frustration.
The Israelites believed they were under judgment. That's the only explanation that why God had punished them and not kept them from their enemies, as they said, as God promised to Abraham.
Right, Peter. So the emotion there might be guilt, right? We've
What are
brought
we,
this
what are
on
we doing
ourselves.
wrong? We screwed up.
Yeah.
How do we fix it?
We screwed up.
Here comes the Messiah.
Yeah. What other emotions might there be swirling around?
I think you have fear. Having moved to Canada, that was not my country. I didn't know how you fit in, and it's the same language, many of the same things, but you're unsettled because everything is unfamiliar.
Beautiful, Susan. Yeah, fear. That's a great one. I see Kate nodding her head. Yeah. Other emotions.
To run away.
Yeah, so that desire to sort of just escape. Yeah.
They also may have felt resentment toward God that he hadn't fulfilled his promise or had backed out of his promise.
Or had fulfilled his promise and they wish he hadn't, right? The promise to punish.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe even frustration with your fellow people. You may feel like you walked the road and feeling like your neighbors, friends, countrymen let you down, or you all let each other down.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that might be an emotion that we feel in a contemporary time, right?
Yeah.
How did we get here?
Yeah.
Right. I was trying hard. How did we get here? Yeah.
I think there's no longer a sense of place. Like if you were living in Jerusalem, it would have been very familiar. and now you're 800 or 1,000 miles away in Babylon. And all of a sudden, those things that you took for granted, like going to the temple and praying, or the holidays, even if you weren't serious about it, they're all gone.
Yeah.
And now you have, you know, where do you pray? How do you celebrate the holidays? You know, everything's so foreign.
And dislocation.
You're kind of stripped of your identity as a Jew. You're stripped of all those customs and forced to pretty much follow somebody else's against your own will.
But there might have been determination also.
Say more, Loretta.
Determination to mean we've come this far. We're going to do it. You know, we're going to make it.
Yeah, I think those two poles are exactly right. The sort of feeling of dislocation, confusion, stripped of identity, and determination that maybe we yet could be faithful in this exile. And I think that really is the question at the heart of this week's chapter, is how are we called? And I use that first person pronoun intentionally. How are we called to be faithful in a foreign land, in exile, in a place where our allegiance is demanded elsewhere? And I say that as a first person, because I don't think this chapter is actually fundamentally historical. I mean, there's lots of wonderful historical bits here, right? We have the great empires of the ancient Near East rolling over each other. We have these great stories, of course. It is historical, but it should be, I think, something that we can relate to. That's why I wanted to sort of start us with the emotions, because it's not just the ancient Israelites who know what exile is. The New Testament uses the language of exile over and over again to speak about us as people of faith. The New Testament uses words like sojourners, or resident aliens, or pilgrims going home, or pilgrims longing for a better country. The New Testament speaks over and over again of the faithful as the followers of Jesus. Jesus himself says, you will be in the world, but not of the world. And I think that that's a really important dynamic to pay attention to, an emotion to tap into as people of faith, that of course we're not meant to be otherworldly people, right? We have lives to lead. We have responsibilities to our neighbors, right? We're not meant to just sort of hide in a closet and pray all day long, right? We live in this world. We are in the world, but we're fundamentally not of it, right? There is, for the person of faith, some longing for more love, more justice, more truth, more beauty, more peace, and a holy discomfort with the way things are, right? A sense that the world is not as we think God would long for it to be. And that can be true in sort of big systemic ways, looking at the injustices of the world, right? At racism or economic inequality or violence or political discord. But it could also be looking at illness in our own lives or in the lives of those whom we love, looking at the reality of death itself and thinking, we know that this is not the will of God. We know this is not what pleases God, right? We have a holy discomfort. And so I just want to have that in the back of our heads as we're telling these great stories about, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and, all these great characters, right? The prophets, Isaiah and Ezekiel. They're all great historical figures, but I hope that we can continually remind ourselves and pay attention to how we are in this story, because we are, as I've said many times in this time together, if the end of the Bible is the end of history, right, the creation of a new heaven and a new earth, well, we're not there yet. So we're in the Bible too. We're in biblical time, which means we can find our place in the stories of the scriptures. So all these great stories are about how to live in that period of exile and where to place your trust and your allegiance? And maybe more provocatively, what will you bow down to? What will you give your heart to? What will you place at the center of your life? And we see that play out in all those stories from the book of Daniel, right? Let's tell them to each other. What's the first great story that we see in Daniel, or at least in the
The
past?
Lion's Den.
So we're not there. That's a great one, Elizabeth, but that's coming up. What's the first one?
Being thrown into the fire. Furnace.
This is
Shadrach,
the
Meshach,
earliest
and
memory
Abednego.
of children.
Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego.
Exactly. My earliest memory of children's ministry was being in that musical, and having to learn these names and how to say them over and over again. So we have the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they are living in Babylon, and they are friends of Daniel's, right? And why? What gets them in trouble? What gets them in this fiery furnace?
They won't bow down to the gold god that Nebuchadnezzar had built.
Right. So there's an idol, a golden statue, and they won't worship it. Right. So while I'm asking us to think theoretically and about the idols in our lives, quite literally, they have a physical idol and they won't worship it. And so Nebuchadnezzar throws them in the fire. And what happens?
They don't burn.
So firstly, they don't burn. That's pretty amazing. And what?
There's the presence of an angel.
So say more, John.
There's the presence of the angel. He sees 4 people inside the furnace. The 3 people that carried them to the furnace end up collapsing and dying because of the heat and the urgency. But when they look into the furnace, they see a 4th figure, and he determines that it's the angel of their God, not his.
So Nebuchadnezzar sees this 4th person with them in the fire, a symbol of divine presence, right? In the trials of our lives and the fires of our lives.
Yeah. He's
And-
walking with them.
Yes.
Right. The angels with them in their most terrible moment, protecting them. And what does Nebuchadnezzar do?
He praises them.
Yes.
And says that no one should blaspheme the God of these 3 prophets. And if they do, they will be punished.
Yeah. Yeah. What I love is as the path pointed out, he calls this God the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Right.
Right. Which should have echoes in our heads of back in Genesis, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? How often in the scriptures, the God, right? The God of all the universe is identified with particular people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is just a great reminder to us that most of the time we only really encounter God through the love and care of one another. That's often how we experience God in our lives, and that's often how we can show God and bear witness to God in the lives of others, and make, as the great Jewish philosopher and theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel said, make faith credible. You can make faith believable for other people, credible, by how you live. Right? That's what saints do. They help other people believe that God is real. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do that by their faithfulness, right? And Nebuchadnezzar is amazed by it, but Nebuchadnezzar doesn't last. Who's the new king?
Belshazzar.
Balthazar. Yeah, like the restaurant in Soho. Right?
No, that's
That's
Balthazar.
Balthazar. I know.
And Lawrence
that?
Durrell.
So Belshazzar is the new king. I mentioned the restaurant in Soho because I always think of Belshazzar as a party animal, right? What's Belshazzar known for?
He has a big feast, and he uses the vessel that were taken from Jerusalem to have a feast.
Yeah, all the gold vessels.
Silver.
From the temple.
Yeah, from the
So
temple.
Belshazzar gets a little tipsy, and he brings in the fine gold and silver from the temple and profanes it, right? By using it not for its purposes, which of course were to make offerings to the living God, but instead to have a party. And not just because he's using it for a party, but he's intentionally profaning it, right? He's saying this has no value, right? This is just for my pleasure, right? Rather than put God at the center of his life, which is what worship does, he's putting himself and his own desires at the center.
He's also blessing the gods of the silver, the gold, and the wood. He's blessing the gods of those and bypassing the God that Jerusalem was built for. You know, I mean, the temple was built for altogether.
Yeah, beautiful, right? Mistaking the beauty of the created thing for the beauty of the creator, right? Might be how we might think of that. And what happens in the midst of this bacchanal?
The fickle
Finger writes on the wall.
Yes. He sees the writing on the wall, as the expression goes, of course, right? The expression that comes from this very story. And the blood drains from his face, because that would be terrifying. And so what does he do?
He tries to get someone to interpret the writing because he cannot read it.
Right. Have you noticed that this is what leaders always do in these Bible stories? Right? There's a sign that comes and the leader's like, wait, I don't understand. Somebody needs to tell me, right? This is true of Pharaoh with Joseph, asking Joseph to interpret dreams. Think of Herod calling the wise men to try to explain the star, right? Leaders like to be in charge. They like to know what's going on. They like to have all the information. So Belshazzar wants to know what the writing on the wall means.
That job is done by Beltway bandits and think tanks.
Yeah, exactly, Michael. Exactly. What is old is new. So who can interpret the writing on the wall, rather?
His own guys can't.
Right.
Daniel.
Which of course reminds us of the Herod story, right? Herod asks his wise men too, not the wise men, but his wise guys, you know, what does this star mean? I got nothing, right? So Daniel interprets the dream, and he's pretty clear, right? He does not lack courage in speaking truth to power. And what's the response from Belshazzar?
He heeds the message.
Yeah, he received
Gratitude.
it.
Yeah, gratitude.
Yeah. You know, I say that in part because I think that these stories from the exilic period, the period when Israel is in exile, are complicating a dynamic that is present in the Bible of sort of us, them, right? In a lot of the Old Testament, there was a sense, and we've seen it in the Holy Wars and other places, of like, well, we're with God and they're the enemy, right? There can be a real us, them dynamic. And I think some of these exilic texts are saying, okay, them, they have some funny worship practices and they're not always kind to us, and they can attack us and be capricious even. But there's also a sense of they might just be human, right? And might be open to encounter and change and growth. They might, in fact, even be useful to God. And I think that these exilic texts put a nice word into the scriptural tradition to remind us that just because someone doesn't immediately agree with us doesn't mean we can't have a fruitful encounter and conversation.
But he doesn't last long enough to have much of a fruitful conversation.
Well, that's true, Martha. What happens that very night?
He dies. He gets killed.
He goes to meet his maker.
Yeah.
And he's replaced by Darius, right? Darius the Mede.
Yeah, apparently the Persians overrun them at that point or something.
Yeah, so we see our, what we know from world history coming into the story, right? Darius is a real person who, as these other guys are, but who is remembered in all sorts of traditions. He's a player on the world stage, and he becomes the new king. And what is Darius's reaction to this Hebrew prophet truth teller?
Hogwash.
Well, eventually, but not at first, right? Doesn't he honor Belshazzar's
Yeah.
of Daniel?
Yeah.
Yes, he does.
He sort of adopts him.
Yeah, he makes him one of
He
his
sets him up as one of the presidents of his
Yeah.
empire.
Yeah.
Yeah. First one of the 120 satraps, and then sort of gets promoted above that too. And that's what sets in motion the problem, right? The people around him get jealous, right? Why does he get all this? Right? We see that one of the, most common of sins in the scriptural witness, right? Jealousy. We saw that in all those great sibling rivalries back in Genesis, right? How
Is this the purple robe offer with the gold chain?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
How pernicious it is, right? How much disquiet it causes us when we look at what somebody else has rather than experience gratitude for what we have. So what do these jealous guys do? They make a law, right?
They tricked Darius into making one.
And what the law says, what?
You have to worship.
You can't pray to God.
Yeah.
They make him the god, and everybody who doesn't acknowledge Darius as the god has to be punished or killed.
Yeah.
So if you pray to anyone but Darius, human or divine, for 30 days, you're in trouble, right?
Right.
Yep.
So much like the Roman emperors who will come after, right? Darius sets himself up as not just the political leader, but as the center of the universe, right? As the one in whom your future and your hope and your life lies secure, right? You do know that the term for the Pope, right, Pontifex Maximus, the high priest, was also claimed by the Roman emperors, right? And the term Kyrios, Lord, was claimed by the Roman emperors, and the term Son of God was claimed by the Roman emperors, right? So they have a precursor in Darius, right? Kind of blending religious and political power. So the punishment, of course, for breaking that law is, as Elizabeth reminded us earlier, the lion's den, right? Someone who breaks this law finds themselves in the lion's den. And so, of course, Daniel breaks the law, right? Daniel knows.
And we hear it in the Fiddler on the Roof.
It's been a long time since I've seen Fiddler on the Roof, so I'm not sure I've
There's a song in it with Daniel in the lion's den.
Right.
Nice. Yeah. Another classic story, right? That's kind of leapt off the page of scripture into the popular imagination. And so Daniel's thrown into the lion's den and they seal the stone. I loved that this week. I had sort of forgotten that detail, and I love that the path pointed that out, that much like Jesus' body is put in the tomb and the stone is rolled, right?
Mm-hmm.
Daniel's put in what Darius thinks will be his tomb, right? And they roll the stone into place to seal in death. And much like Jesus' own resurrection, it doesn't work, right? What happens early in the morning on the first day of the week, right? Right. We see these echoes across scripture. It's not just the women running to the tomb to see the empty tomb and the resurrected Christ. It's Darius running to see what's happened. And what does he find?
Not what he hoped.
Daniel, untouched.
Right? Daniel, the stone rolled away. Daniel fine, not a scratch on his body. And he is appropriately amazed, right? And I think, having told these fantastical and wonderful stories, it's worth kind of pulling back the lens. So what does it mean, right? What ties these stories together? And I think what it meant for the Israelites at the time, and can mean for us, is a reminder that God is always at work. Maybe most especially when things are most difficult, often in surprising ways among surprising people. But that if, as God's people, we keep our eyes fixed on God, if we keep God at the center of our life, right, and don't bow down and worship all the other shiny things that might distract, might promise to deliver us, as we talked about last week, right? That we would find true peace, that we would have the blessing of peace. And I think what's interesting about this exile period is that sometimes loss is the space that helps us really perceive value. Does that make sense? That it's often when we are in a difficult place where the things that we take for granted are taken away from us, that we really know what is most important in our lives, right? And it's like the stories of when people survive some sort of horrific incident and they share, it wasn't that I was thinking about my 401k or thinking about that career move that I made that wasn't the right one. I was thinking about my loved ones. I was thinking about my spouse. I was thinking about the things that really do endure. And
that's very appropriate for tonight with Martin Luther King and the things he said about darkness and light.
Yes,
Amen.
Judy, yes.
And so, in a way, it's not surprising that in the exile period, where so much seems to be taken away, this is precisely where the people of Israel start putting together the scriptures in their final form, right? It's when the people of Israel think that it might all be lost that they put into final form the Pentateuch, those first 5 books of Moses, and really make sure that they have the story of their faith to carry them into this uncertain future. And I think that's a beautiful reminder, right? When we are uncertain, going back to the word, going back to the story of how God has been faithful to us in the past can help us face the present and live into the future. It's also a reminder, right, that in this time that seemed so crazy, it wasn't just that they looked at how God's word, it wasn't just that they looked to the past of God's word, right? It wasn't just that they pulled together the Pentateuch. It was also where they were really trying to pay attention to how God's word was active then, right, in the prophets. And so I love how the path kind of reminds us that the prophets weren't just speaking words of judgment, but also words of promise, not just words of condemnation and prediction of destruction, but also words of consolation and prediction of a kind of restoration and reconciliation that is really beyond anything the people could muster on their own, right? That's what struck me anew as I read all those great passages from Isaiah, right? That the path pulls together, right? Passages that we
They're
all
so beautiful
Christmas
too.
time. They're so beautiful. And they're all about what God is doing to intervene, to make a way, right? God is the one who's sending the child who will be born for us as the mighty counselor and prince of peace, right? It's God who's filling up the valleys and leveling the hills and making a straight way in the desert to take the people home. It's God who's going to create a new heaven and earth. It's God who's going to pour out his
God's
spirit on
words
the
that
anointed.
don't fade.
Pardon?
He has this beautiful thing where he talks about the grass and the flowers, but the word will still be there.
Exactly. Not because of anything we do, right? These prophecies are that even in the midst of our faithlessness and our reaping the whirlwind, right? Reaping the consequences of the sin, right? That's what Israel has done. Even in that dark place, God is making a way. God is faithful. And it's not just Isaiah, right? It's also this new prophet, Ezekiel. And that's where I want to leave us before sending us off into small groups, because Ezekiel is just too awesome. And there's too much great art in the St. John's Bible for us not to have a little conversation about Ezekiel. So Ezekiel is a prophet that comes up in the exilic time, right? Unlike Isaiah and Jeremiah, who are pre-exile, but speak a word that continues to be heard in exile. Ezekiel arises in this period of disruption. And that, I think, is, in and of itself, a word of hope, right? That even in exile, God is at work bringing prophets. And Ezekiel is really famous for a lot of things, but kind of for three prophecies. Four, really. First, his own call is pretty interesting. Secondly, he has this vision of the Lord departing Jerusalem. Okay, so you have to kind of put on your historical hat. He's sitting in exile, and he's trying to explain to the people in exile, how is it that God allowed this to happen? And he has this vision of the wheels turning. It's almost like a helicopter. And so his vision is like the Lord is lifting off and leaving Jerusalem. And that's both a word of condemnation, right? God was so fed up with the sins, he's left Israel, right? And that's what allowed this destruction to happen. But it's also a word of hope, right? It's not just that God has left Jerusalem and left it open to be ransacked. It's God has come here to be with us. It works in both ways, right? So that's sort of the first vision that Ezekiel's most famous for. The second is far more famous. You've probably heard it 25 times, right? The vision of the dry bones.
Yeah.
If you are a regular at the Easter Vigil, then this story is used at that service most years. It's also the subject of some of the great children's songs in the camp tradition, right?
Yeah. Them bones, dry bones.
Exactly.
Dry bones.
And the hip bone's connected to the thigh bone, right?
Right.
I always get them out of order. I wasn't very good at anatomy. Anyway, so in the St. John's Bible, we have this great illumination of the story of the dry bones. Now, just to kind of recap, I know you all read it, but of course, this is a prophecy that God will breathe on the bones of Israel and they'll live. Right? And it's a story or prophecy about death on all sorts of levels, right? But especially the kind of spiritual dryness of the people in exile, and a promise that this people that seems broken, that seems shattered, that seems dry, will have life fill them again. They'll stand up and be whole, and they'll return home because God's breath will be in them. And what you might notice in this illumination is just how provocatively realistic the St. John's depiction of death is. And one of the things that I read about in this preparing for this is that some of these skulls are actually work or images adapted from real skulls from Armenia and Bosnia and Iraq and Rwanda, right? Some of the
It looks like there are a bunch of spectacles there. Right before.
Yeah,
like the Holocaust. Yes.
Yeah, the spectacles from the Holocaust. You've got all this broken glass.
I love the cars.
Cars, a riot.
Right. So you've got civil unrest, cars, you've got the broken glass that might speak also to civil unrest, but maybe also to Kristallnacht and to other parts of the Holocaust. You've got the glasses. You've got all these very, very evocative images of death. But you also have these gold squares, right? Which throughout the St. John's Bible has been a symbol of divine presence, right? So the artists are making a statement of faith, right? That God is present even in the darkest of places. There is no place where we could go that God would not go with us. Even the very pits of hell, and that God is at work there. And so what I love here is you see at the bottom of this illumination, the rainbow breaking out. That even in the midst of death, God is bringing something new. And of course, at the top of that page, you see the new, right? You see the prophecy fulfilled, right? That God's breath has brought these bones back to life and filled them with life and with joy. And that's, of course, depicted in the colors of the rainbow, right? Which evokes the Noah story and life after death. We have the menorah, the promise to Abraham, right? To be a great nation that is shining forth here at the top of the page. And also you have that image divided into 7 parts. So an image of recreation of the new heavens and the new earth. So this is Ezekiel's second famous prophecy, right? That God is at work in the death of exile, where people feel dry, maybe spiritually dry, cut off from God, cut off from one another, and God's going to put them back together. Not because they're going to put themselves back together, but because of the Spirit of God. Anything else you notice in this illumination?
I'm always reminded, I've seen this a couple times, but the top part always reminds me, those of us who've been through a couple of the services of the Holy Spirit, when we bring out the, I guess on Pentecost, when we bring out the banners, and it always kind of reminds me of that.
That kind of motion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for saying that, Kim, because of course the dove, the spirit moving is exactly right? The spirit that hovered over the face of the waters.
Kind of feels that way. Yeah.
Life, even at creation.
The gold swirl, the gold lines sort of look like a menorah.
Exactly. I think very intentionally, right? We saw back when in the promise to Abraham, there were those menorahs representing his family branching out, and we see it again in Matthew. The genealogy of Jesus is structured like a menorah, which might evoke a kind of tree of life, right? That we're part of.
Beautiful.
So then the third vision that Ezekiel has that's really quite profound is of a new Jerusalem itself. So that's the final word that Ezekiel speaks to the people in exile, is not just that God's going to be with you in the death of exile and raise you up and bring you home, but then a kind of fantastical, mystical vision of what that new home will look like. So, dry bones is one chapter. It's chapter 37 of the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel goes on for 8 chapters, chapters 40 through 48, in the most kind of wonderful and boring and dense detail you can possibly imagine about what this new Jerusalem is going to look like. And so I want to share with you that illumination and talk a little bit about it. And while I pull that up, I'll also just, behind me, one of my favorite things, this is the map of New Haven from 1644, I think. And you might recognize its shape. You see 9 squares. And
oh, isn't that interesting?
On Ezekiel's map there, you see 9 squares too. New Haven was actually planned by the Puritans off of a Brazilian Jesuits writing on city planning based on Ezekiel chapter 40. And the idea was to make a new haven, a new heaven, right? And so it was this Jesuit idea that all cities should be planned based on the New Jerusalem.
Love it.
So next time you're in New Haven and they talk about 9th Square, it's not just about good pizza. It's part of this vision of the new heavens. So Ezekiel draws this fantastical vision of something on the one hand deeply ordered, right? This kind of squares, all these very precise measurements about where the gates are and how big they'll be and what the rooms are, but also kind of hard to really imagine, and fantastical in its imagery and in the size. And in that way, it's a little like the book of Revelation at the end. But what I love about what the St. John's Bible folks have done with this illumination is kind of play up the mystery of it, and the glory of it with this beautiful colors, the nod toward kind of an architectural model, but it's not really an architectural model. And then this sense of a labyrinth, which we've seen before, back when we were talking about Solomon and the depiction of the temple there. We had that kind of winding, weaving gold path into the center of the temple. You remember that back in Solomon? Well, we have it here again. And while it might look like a maze, right? Of course, a maze is meant to trick you, right? And to get you lost. This is a labyrinth, which is actually the exact opposite of a maze. A labyrinth, there's only one path. It's very twisty and turny. Sometimes you think you're going right to the center and then it turns you back out again and you do another loop, but there's no choices to be made in a labyrinth. You just have to keep going and it will get you to the center and then back out again. And I think this is a deliberate choice on the part of the St. John's Bible folks to say that while the life of faith may sometimes feel like a maze, may sometimes feel like there are all these turns or whatever, when we're walking in faith, when we're actively seeking God, it's always a labyrinth. It's always God drawing us in closer, until we, at our end, reach that true home, reach that better country, reach that place where we're no longer a sojourner or a resident alien, but a beloved child at home in God's presence. That's the vision that Ezekiel offers the people in the middle of their exile. And I think as we think about what it means to be faithful and to live in our exile, that's worth remembering. I don't know who first said it, but I was associated with a woman named Robin, who was my youth minister at the church I grew up in. I know Robin didn't make this up, but she always said it to me. She always said, remember who and whose you are. Have you guys heard that one before?
Yeah.
No.
Remember who and whose you are.
Mm-hmm.
That was her advice to me when I graduated high school and went off to college. I mostly remembered it, not always. But what great advice, right? Stick close to the one who loves you, right? Stick close to the one who is faithful to you. That's what the life of faith is. Remember who you are and remember who you belong to. And I think that's what Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Ezekiel all have in common, that even in this space where they were not at home, they remembered who they ultimately belonged to. They remembered who to put at the center of their life. They remembered who to bow down to, who to give priority to. And so that's what I want us to spend a little time in groups talking about, is as we live in our lives, right? Not in Babylon or Persia, but in 21st century America, as we live as resident aliens in, but maybe not of the world, with a longing for more, what does it look like? What does it look like for us to try to keep God at the center? And how do we do that? How do we try to stay clear about the things that most matter, and not allow ourselves to be distracted by or to bow down to the things that ultimately won't give us life? So that's what I'd like us to spend a little time talking about. I think everybody else is about to join us. Okay. I think everybody's back. So anybody want to share from your conversation?
I have a question for you, Ryan. I
Yeah.
think you mentioned it earlier in your remarks. Because we have Darius, we kind of know the time. Where are we in the history of the world?
We are in the mid 500s.
Mid 500s. Okay.
Yeah. So while the exile has this huge power in the Israelite imagination, it's only 70 years from the 590s to the 520s. So, so we're somewhere in there. Anybody else want to share from your group? Did you find it easy to think about how this relates to your own life, or was that a challenge? There's no wrong answer.
I think our group talked more about how COVID is sort of, with some people, really alienated their lives from their activities and really missing church, particularly in that gathering. And then if you're a young mother, you're just the opposite. You're inundated with so much activity that would normally be, the kids would normally be in school. And so younger people are experiencing this very differently than the older, but we got on the COVID conversation.
Yeah, but I love that, Gloria, because regardless of whether you're more shut in or more stressed, you're alienated from routine, right? We're alienated from what we're used to. And that seems just like exile to me.
Good point. Our group focused on remember who you are and whose you are and how we do that, I think, and how we keep God in the center of our lives in various ways, like staying connected to community and praying and other things that people mentioned.
In our group, we felt that a major way of staying connected to God was through St. Luke's. That was a lifeline for all of us.
Yeah. Beautiful. So true. I was remembering something, one of my other favorite things to say to the altar guild, which is, so forgive church chat, as Dan likes to say, but the corporal that we use, that we put out on the altar, that the bread and the wine go on when we celebrate the Eucharist, I can't prove it, but I'm willing to make an argument that very corporal design, like New Haven, is based on Ezekiel's New Jerusalem, 9 squares. And I think.
What is the corporal?
So the corporal is like a placemat. It's a white linen, just lays flat on top of the altar linen, and it's 9 squares. And it's meant so you could fold up and keep the crumbs from the bread inside. But I think it's also meant to say that in the Eucharist, as we share communion, as we are church together, we're not just in this world, we're participating in the world to come. We're having a foretaste of the heavenly banquet. We're sharing in the divine life. And so I love that. The other thing that came to me, and I'll leave it at this and send us on our way, is it's Dolly Parton's 75th birthday.
Oh.
I know everybody was already really celebrating that and excited about that. But Dolly Parton has a great quote that is a little like remember who and whose you are. And it's one of my favorites, which is, she says, find out who you are and do it on purpose. Find out who you are and do it on purpose. And I think that as people of faith, that's our challenge, is to know who we are as beloved children of God, as people who have that vision of the world that God would have be on earth as it is in heaven, and then choose actively day by day to live that way, to live by speaking that truth, by sharing that love, by enacting that peace, by seeking after that justice, right? Find out who you are and do it on purpose. So wherever we are, whatever exiles we experience, we can do that, like Daniel and like Ezekiel. So Would somebody like to pray us out and send us off into this night? Don't all jump at one time. I'm just going to start randomly asking you. I won't do that tonight.
I'll do it, Ryan.
You don't like me.
I'll
Thank you,
go ahead and
Maggie.
do it.
Oh, thank you, Maggie.
Yeah. Dear Lord, thank you for letting us gather and be together virtually with you. We're grateful for our leaders and our many voices chiming in to echo the stories that so many people have read and heard from different places and different points of view. Let us consider with open hearts all of these ideas as we read your stories today and for every day. Amen.
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 Thank you, Maggie.
Thank
Great
you.
to be with you.
Beautiful.
It was a beautiful prayer. And I hope as people of prayer, we all keep our country in our prayers tonight and tomorrow as we mark a historic day and pray for our country and pray for those who have the burden of leading us in this challenging time. I think today is a historic day for that, not just the transfer of power, but also coming to 400,000 people who have died from coronavirus. So let us continue to pray for wisdom and for grace in our leaders. So
Thank you,
thank
Ryan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good
Good night,
night.
everybody.